Welcome to Fundamentals of Cybersecurity, CSCI150N. This is Chapter 20, Risk Management. I'm your instructor, Peter Keurig. In this chapter, you will learn how to use risk management tools and principles to manage risk effectively, explore risk management strategies, describe risk models, explain the difference between qualitative and quantitative risk assessments, use risk management tools, and examine risk management best practices. The outline for this chapter is an overview of risk management, what is risk management, business risks, risk mitigation strategies, risk management models, qualitatively assessing risk, quantitatively assessing risk, qualitative versus quantitative risk assessments, tools, and risk management best practices. Risk management is an essential element of management from the enterprise level down to the individual project. Risk management encompasses all the actions taken to reduce complexity, increase objectivity, and identify important decision factors. Businesses must take risks to retain their competitive edge. However, as a result, risk management must occur as part of managing any business, program, or project. Risk management is about making a business profitable, not buying insurance. Risk is about the possibility of suffering a loss. Risk management is the overall decision-making process of identifying threats and vulnerabilities and their potential impact, determining the cost to mitigate such events, and deciding what actions are cost-effective for controlling these risks. Risk assessment is the process of analyzing an environment to identify the risks, threats, and vulnerabilities, and mitigating actions to determine either quantitatively or qualitatively the impact of an event that would affect a project, program, or business, also referred to as risk analysis. An asset is any resource or information an organization needs to conduct its business. A threat is any circumstances or event with the potential to cause harm to an asset. For example, a malicious hacker might choose to hack your system by using readily available hacking tools. Other threats can include environmental factors or accidents. Threat actors is the entity behind a threat. Threat vector is a method used to affect a threat. For example, malware, a threat that is delivered via a watering hole attack vector. A vulnerability is any characteristic of an asset that can be exploited by a threat to cause harm. A vulnerability can also be the result of a lack of security controls or weaknesses in controls. Your system has a security vulnerability if, for example, you have not installed patches to fix a cross-site scripting error on your web server. Likewise, if you have not effectively trained your users, they can be vulnerabilities as well. Impact is the loss or harm resulting when a threat exploits a vulnerability. A malicious hacker, the threat agent, uses a cross-site scripting tool to hack your unpatched website, the vulnerability. Stealing credit card information, the threat, that is then used fraudulently. The credit card company pursues legal recourses against your company to recover those losses from the credit card fraud, the impact. A control is a measure taken to detect, prevent, or mitigate the risk associated with a threat, also called countermeasure or safeguard. A control can be technical, it can be administrative, like policies, or physical, like setting up a fence or a badge reader on a door. Qualitative risk assessment is the process of subjectively determining the impact of an event that affects a project, program, or business. Completing the assessment usually involves the use of expert judgment, experience, or group consensus. Quantitative risk assessment is the process of objectively determining the impact of an event that affects a project, program, or business. Completing the assessment usually involves the use of metrics and models. Mitigate refers to taking action to reduce the likelihood of a threat occurring and to reduce the impact of a threat if a threat does occur. Single loss expectancy is the monetary loss or impact of each occurrence of a threat exploiting a vulnerability. So how much is expected to be lost if an actual incident occurs by a vulnerability being exploited? Exposure factor is a measure of the magnitude of loss of an asset, used in calculating of single loss expectancy. So for example, exposure factor could be if you have a $50 million database and your expected exposure factor is 50% or 0.5, then you expect you can lose up to $25 million if that $50 million database is compromised. Annualized rate of occurrence is the frequency with which an event is expected to occur on an annualized basis. So if it's expected to happen once a year, the ARO is 1. If it's expected to happen twice a year, the ARO is 2. If it's expected to happen every 2 years, then the ARO is 0.5. And if it's expected to happen, let's say, once every 5 years, then your ARO is a 0.2. Annualized loss expectancy is how much of an event is expected to cost per year. So, talking about that $50 million database, if the exposure factor is 0.5, or half the value of that database, then you're expecting a single loss expectancy is of $25 million. But if that loss is expected to happen once every, let's say, 5 years, or an ARO of 0.2, then your annualized expected loss would be $5 million. Systematic is the chance of loss that is predictable under relatively stable circumstances. Examples such as fire, wind, or flood produce losses that in the aggregate over time can be accurately predicted despite short-term fluctuations. Systematic risk can be diversified away, which gives managers a level of control that can be employed. Unsystematic risk is the chance of a loss that is unpredictable in the aggregate because it is the result of forces difficult to predict. Examples include, but are not limited to, recessions, unemployment, epidemics, war-related events, and so forth. Unsystematic risk cannot be mitigated via diversification, limiting management's responses. Hazard is a circumstance that increases the likelihood or probable severity of a loss. For example, running systems without antivirus is a hazard because it increases the probability of loss due to malware. Types of controls can be classified based on the type of actions they perform. There are 3 classes of controls that exist: management or administrative controls, technical controls, and operational or physical controls. Management or administrative are usually policies and procedures. Technical are some kind of technical device or software, such as antivirus or firewall. And operational or physical is procedures and steps such as in how you do your backups on your database, or having security guards put into place, or other things that go on in a day-to-day operation that provide control or reduce risk. For each of these classes, there are 6 types of controls. There's deterrent, which is to discourage occurrences. A security camera system or security guards can act as a deterrent because criminals are less likely to go after a target where they know there's recording going on or where they know there's guards available. Preventative is to avoid the occurrence. So preventative things such as putting antivirus on in order to prevent malware infections on a computer would be preventative. Detective is things that are used to detect or identify that an occurrence has happened. That can be a alarm system. It could be, once again, the camera system. If it didn't deter the criminal, at the very least, it could help detect that something happened. It could be an IDS on your network. It could be a lot of different things. Corrective is to correct or restore a control that is not correct at the time. So, for example, corrective control is patching systems. It's correcting flaws in the software, or properly configuring firewalls, or setting in firewall rules that are stronger than the previous ones. Those are corrective. They're correcting deficiencies. Recovery is to restore resources, capabilities, or losses. So if you lose a database due to hard drive failure and you restore the data, that's recovery. Compensating is to mitigate when direct control is not possible. So if you, for example, have a server that has a piece of software that requires a certain port to be open for that software to work, but there's really no need for everybody to have access to that port, even though it's on there, what you might do is set up a firewall blocking traffic and only allowing specific traffic that should have access to that port through. That's compensating, because you can't turn off that that port because you need it for some reason. So you compensate by putting another control in place, the firewall, that blocks unwanted traffic. There are 3 definitions related to risk management, which reveal why it is sometimes considered difficult to understand. The dictionary defines risk as the possibility of suffering harm or loss. Carnegie Mellon University's Software Engineering Institute defines continuous risk management as processes, methods, and tools for managing risk in a project. It provides a disciplined environment for proactive decision-making to assess continuously what could go wrong, risk, determine what risks are important to deal with, and implement strategies to deal with those risks. And then finally, the Information System Audit and Control Association, also known as ISACA, says, in modern business terms, risk management is the process of identifying vulnerabilities and threats to an organization's resources and assets and deciding what countermeasures, if any, to take to reduce the level of risk to an acceptable level based on the value of the asset to the organization. These 3 definitions show that risk management is based upon what can go wrong and what actions should be taken. So when you identify a risk, is the risk the responsibility of your organization? If no, then delegate it to the appropriate organization. If yes, does mitigating the risk cost more than the impact? So if it costs you $1 million to prevent something, or prevent a risk that's only going to cost $5,000 if it happens, then the answer is yes, it costs more to mitigate than it does for the impact, and so you just accept the risk as it is. If the answer is no, if it's more, let's say it costs you $1 million to mitigate, but it's valued at $5 or $6 million, then you want to mitigate the risk. Is it cheaper to have third party assume that risk? In other words, if the value of something like your car, for example, let's say your car is worth $20,000. If it costs you for a comprehensive policy for insurance each year $1,500 versus you having the $20,000 in your pocket if something were to happen to your car, is it cheaper to have a third party assume that risk? In this case, the insurance company. And in this case, the answer is yes. So if the insurance company for your cybersecurity is saying that the policy to protect your data is $1 million a year, and it costs your department only $500,000 to provide the security, then the answer is no, and just go ahead and mitigate it. If the answer is that it costs $1 million for the policy, but it's going to cost you $2 million to mitigate it yourself, then you're going to transfer the risk to the insurance company because it's less expensive than trying to mitigate the risk. Organizations have a culture associated with their operations. Frequently, this culture is set and driven by the activities of senior management personnel. The risk management culture of an organization can have an effect upon the actions taken by others. So if the risk management style or the management style of your organization is pathological, then when it comes to situational awareness, they really don't want to know what's going on. And they're usually going to shoot the messenger. And as far as responsibility goes, they're going to look for somebody else to blame other than assuming responsibility. Failures are usually punished, and ideas and solutions are usually discouraged. Now, if the management style is bureaucratic, you may not find out that there is a problem, the situational awareness. Communication style is heard if it arrives. Otherwise, there could be enough red tape that the information never gets to the source it needs to get to. Responsibility is usually compartmentalized, and failures are usually the responsibility of the local compartment, and it's locally dealt with. Ideas and solutions beget usually problems. It's what some people might refer to as good idea fairies in those environments. Now, if your management style for your organization is enlightened, think today's internet startup cultures, situational awareness is usually actively sought. They're looking to know what's going on. Communication is usually messengers are rewarded, so you don't necessarily have to be afraid to be the bearer of bad news if the result of that bad news is an improvement upon the organization. Responsibility is shared across the different portions or compartments of the organization as necessary. Failures are usually a source of reform, learning lessons from failures, as opposed to being afraid of making and being punished for a failure. And then ideas and solutions are usually welcomed. So when it comes to today with business risks, no comprehensive identification of all risks in a business environment is possible. In today's technologically dependent business environment, risk is often simplistically divided into two areas: business risk and a major subset, technology risk. So examples of business risk usually involve financial or other business aspects or management aspects of the business. So for example, treasury management of company holdings in bonds, futures, currencies, and so on. There's revenue management risks, the management of consumer behaviors and generation of revenue. Contract management, which is the management of contracts with customers, vendors, partners, and so on. Fraud, which is the deliberate deception made for personal gain to obtain property or services, and so on. Environmental risks, which is the management of risks associated with factors that affect the environment. Regulatory risks, which is managing risks that arise from new or existing regulations. Business continuity management, which is the management of risks associated with recovering and restoring business functions after disaster or major disruption occurs. And finally, technology. The management of risk associated with technology is in many forms. Now, that's that subset we were just talking about, and we'll see that in the next slide. So examples of technology risks are security and privacy, the risks associated with protecting personal, private, and confidential information. Information technology operations, the risks associated with day-to-day operations of information technology systems. Business system controls and effectiveness, the risk associated with manual and automated controls that safeguard company assets and resources. Business continuity management, the risk associated with the technology and processes to be used in the event of a disaster or major disruption. Information system testing, the risks associated with testing processes and procedures of information systems. Reliability and performance management, the risks associated with meeting reliability and performance agreements and measures. Information technology asset management, the risks associated with safeguarding information technology physical assets. Project risk management, the risks associated with managing information technology projects. And then change management, the risks associated with managing configurations and change. Risk mitigation strategies are the action plans developed after a thorough evaluation of possible threats, hazards, and risks associated with business operations. These strategies are employed to lessen the risks associated with operations. The focus of risk mitigation strategies is to reduce the effect of threats and hazards. Common mitigation strategies include change management, incident management, user rights and permissions reviews, audits, and technology controls. So when it comes to change management, configuration management specifically applies to a lower level of detail, the actual configuration of components, such as hosts, devices, and so forth. Configuration management might be considered a subset of change management, but they are not the same thing. Most of today's software and hardware change management practices derive from long-standing system engineering configuration management practices. It is normal for an enterprise to have a change control board to approve all production changes and ensure the change management procedures are followed before the changes are introduced to a system. So configuration control is the process of controlling changes to items that have been baselined. Configuration control ensures that only approved changes to a baseline are allowed to be implemented. Configuration control is the key step that provides valuable insight to managers. If a system is being changed and configuration control is being observed, managers and others concerned will be better informed. One of the other risk mitigating strategies is incident management. When an incident occurs, having an incident response management methodology is a key risk mitigation strategy, because the sooner you can respond and properly manage an incident, the less of an impact the incident will have, and the sooner you'll be able to recover and get back to normal operations. Nearly every organization has some kind of valuable data, so their risk mitigation strategy should include some kind of data loss or theft protection. Data is the primary target of most attackers. The value of the data can vary, making some data more valuable and hence more at risk of theft. Data can also be lost through a variety of mechanisms, with hardware failures, operator error, and system errors being common causes. An organization can take various actions to mitigate the effect of the loss. Backups lead the list of actions. For backups can provide the ultimate protection against loss, because if the data is destroyed or lost, you can restore back up to at least the last backup. However, any information that changed from that last backup to the loss event or the incident may be permanently lost. To prevent theft, a variety of controls can be employed. Some are risk mitigation steps, such as data minimization, which is the act of not storing what isn't needed. If it must be stored and has value, then technology such as data loss prevention can be used to provide a means of protection. So different types of data loss prevention includes applications that work with your email software, be it Microsoft Exchange or whatever, to review the data that's being sent in an email to look for things like credit card numbers and social security numbers. And if there's valuable data in there, it blocks the email from being sent and usually sends a warning either to the user or to the supervisor of the user. Other steps are to prevent things like USB drives from being plugged into the computer, or prevent users from being able to burn CDs or DVDs. There are many different risk management models out there. The first one that was covered by the book is the General Risk Management Model. The following 5 steps can be used in virtually any risk management process, so not just IT or security, but in manufacturing or any other kind of risk scenario. Following these steps will lead to an orderly process of analyzing and mitigating risk. First is asset identification. What is it that we're trying to protect? What is around us? What is it that we own? What is it that we're responsible for? Second, threat assessment. Assessing what are the threats to those assets. Let's say they're laptops. They could be stolen. They could be destroyed by fire. They could be lost. Things of that sort. Impact determination and quantification. What is the impact of the loss of a laptop? Obviously, this is a financial loss because there's capital invested in purchasing that laptop. But what kind of data was on there? Was there personal data? Was there corporate data? Anything of that sort that might cost the company more money, either through lawsuits or liability or some kind of loss of competitive edge? Things of that sort. Control design and evaluation. What are the controls that we can use to reduce this risk? So, for example, we're still using laptops. If we use whole disk encryption to encrypt the data that's on there, so if there is data that's sensitive competitive data or personal information, anything of value of that sort, that if it's stolen or lost, people can't access that data on that hard drive. Then there's residual risk. So yes, we're able to encrypt that hard drive and prevent the data loss if the hard drive was to be stolen or go missing. But there's still a residual risk of the value of that laptop would be lost in the event of the destruction or loss of the device. So residual risk is any risk that continues to be present after you've used mitigating controls. Another risk management model is the Software Engineering Institute model. Here they have 5 steps. Identify or look for risks before they become problems. Then analyze, convert the data gathered into information that can be used to make decisions. Evaluate the impact, probability, and time frame of the risk. Classify and prioritize each of the risks. Step 3 is to plan. Review and evaluate the risks and decide what actions to take to mitigate them. Implement those mitigation actions. Then track. Monitor the risks and the mitigation plans. Trends may provide information to activate plans and contingencies. Review periodically to measure progress and identify new risks. And then finally, control. Make corrections for deviations from the risk mitigation plan. Correct products and processes as required. Changes in business procedures may require adjustments in plans or actions, as do faulty plans and risks that become problems. So really, when you start looking at it, it's almost a circle, because you're going to continue to look for risks. You're going to continue to analyze them and implement controls. You're going to track those controls. And then you're going to make corrections as necessary, and you can continuously do it. It's a continuous loop. The National Institute for Standards and Technology, known as NIST, has several risk models. NIST has several information risk models that can be applied to an enterprise. NIST has published several special publications associated with risk management. Most notably is Special Publication 800-39, Managing Information Security Risk, Organization, Mission, and Information System View, presents several key insights. It establishes a relationship between aggregated risk from information systems and mission business success. It encourages senior leaders to recognize the importance of managing information security risk within the organization. And it helps those with system-level security responsibilities understand how system-level issues affect the organization and mission as a whole. SP 800-39 shows 2 levels. The first level of analysis is represented by 4 elements: frame, assess, respond, and monitor. The second level is related to the tiers represented in the hierarchical triangle of organization, mission business processes, and information systems. So the 3 tiers represent the different distinct layers in an organization that are associated with risk. Tier 1, representing the executive function, is where the risk framing occurs. It's where the organization decides what level of risk it's willing to assume and what strategy it will have, whether it be a proactive or reactive risk strategy. Tier 2, the mission and business process layer, the risk management function of assess, respond, and monitoring occur. So this is where you're going to assess what the risk is, you're going to respond to that risk, and you're going to monitor that risk. Then Tier 3 is the information system layer, where activities of risk management are manifested in the systems of the organization. So this is where you will see the controls in effect based upon the level of risk that the executive function has decided it wants to take, and based upon the mission and business process layer, its assessment, how it responds to its risk findings, and monitor. The three models given in the textbook are examples that define steps that can be used in any general or software risk management process. These risk management principles can be applied to any project, program, or business activity, no matter how simple or complex. So qualitative risk analysis allows expert judgment and experience to assume a prominent role. To assess risk qualitatively, you consider the impact of the threat with the probability of occurrence and assign an impact level and probability level to the risk. A binary assessment is where only two outcomes is possible, kind of a heads or tails situation. So looking at this chart, you have either a high impact or low impact, and a high probability or low probability. The high impact, high probability is your worst case scenario, and that's where you're going to want to put most of your attention when dealing with risk. And you're going to move down based upon from that. A high impact with low probability, you have to weigh against a low impact with high probability. Just how close the two come together on the impact will determine which of those two directions you want to go. And of course, last on the list would be low impact, low probability. When it comes to qualitative risk analysis, though, not everything is binary. There's usually different shades or gradients of levels. So a few threats can usually be identified as presenting a high risk exposure, a few threats can present a low risk exposure, and then others are going to fall in between the two. If analysis is more complex, requiring 3 levels of analysis, such as low, medium, high, or green, yellow, red, can provide up to 9 different possible combinations. Obviously, once again, high and high are your biggest priority, and then from there you have to determine, based upon your organization's risk culture, where you want to go with high impact, medium probability versus medium impact, high probability, and things of that sort. Quantitative risk assessment applies historical information and trends to attempt to predict future performance. Quantitative risk assessments can also rely heavily on models that provide decision-making information in the form of quantitative metrics, which attempt to measure risk levels across a common scale. You can actually add objectivity to a qualitative assessment. It is possible to move a qualitative assessment towards being more quantitative. Making a qualitative assessment more objective can be as simple as assigning a numerical value to qualitative values. So for example, risk equals the value times weight. So for example here, weight times value. So if the business looks at impact, business impact versus probability of attack versus cost to fix versus difficulty to fix, and weighs it 4, 3, 2, 1 in this scale, and then green, yellow, or red can have a value of 3, 2, or 1. You can, obviously the more red you have, the heavier the value will be, and you'll assess your assessment more towards the heavier weight. You can add emphasis to a particular qualitative area by weighing it more. So there are some other things we can do or calculate when looking at quantitative assessing for risk. One is mean time to repair. It's the common measure of how long it takes to repair a given failure. This is the average time and may or may not include the time needed to obtain parts. So for example, I'm going to use your car. If you've ever been to mechanics and you've asked for a quote before they do a job, they base it on a book, usually called the Chilton's Guide, that tells them approximately how long it takes to fix a certain part. And with that information, they give you your quote. So they're giving you basically a mean time to repair. They're factoring in the cost of the part and the approximate amount of time they think it's going to take to fix the product. Mean time between failures is the common measure of reliability of a system and is an expression of the average time between system failures. The time between failures is measured from the time a system returns to service until the next failure. So the mean time between failures is an arithmetic means of a set of system failures. So it's how often do you expect to get a flat tire? It's how often do you expect to have a hard drive break on a computer? Things of that sort. Mean time to failure is a variation of mean time between failures, one that is commonly used instead of mean time between failures, when the system is replaced in lieu of being repaired. Other than a semantic difference, the calculations are the same, and the meaning is essentially the same. Availability is a measure of the amount of time a system performs its intended function. Reliability is the measure of the frequency of system failures. Availability is related to, but different than reliability, and is typically expressed as a percentage of time the system is in its operational state. To calculate availability, both the mean time to failure and the mean time to repair are needed. It is recognized throughout the industry that it's impossible to conduct risk management that is purely quantitative. Usually, risk management includes both qualitative and quantitative elements, requiring both analysis and judgment or experience. In contrast to quantitative assessments, it is possible to accomplish purely qualitative risk management. It is easy to see that it is impossible to define and quantitatively measure all factors that exist in a given risk assessment. It is easy to see that a risk assessment that measures no factors quantitatively but measures them all qualitatively is possible. The decision of whether to use qualitative versus quantitative risk management depends on the criticality of the project, the resources available, and the management style. The decision will be influenced by the degree to which the fundamental risk management metrics, such as asset value, exposure factor, and threat frequency, can be quantitatively defined. Many tools can be used to enhance the risk management process. The following tools can be used during the various phases of risk assessment to add objectivity and structure to the process. Understanding the details of each of these tools is not necessary for the CompTIA Security Plus exam, but understanding what they can be used for is important. More information on these tools can be found in any good project management text. Affinity grouping is a method of identifying items that are related and then identifying the principle that ties them together. Baseline identification and analysis is the process of establishing a baseline set of risks. It produces a snapshot of all the identified risks at a given point in time. Cause and effect analysis, identifying relationships between a risk and the factors that can cause it. This is usually accomplished using fishbone diagrams developed by a former professor of engineering at the Science University of Tokyo. Cost-benefit analysis is a straightforward method of comparing cost estimates to the benefit of a mitigation strategy. Gantt charts are a management tool for diagramming schedules, events, and activity durations. Interrelationship diagrams are a method for identifying cause and effect relationships by clearly defining the problem to be solved, identifying the key elements of the problem, and then describing the relationship between each of the key elements. Pareto charts is a histogram that ranks the categories in a chart from most frequent to least frequent, thus facilitating risk prioritization. PERT charts are diagrams depicting interdependencies between project activities, showing the sequence and duration of each activity. When complete, the chart shows the time necessary to complete the project and the activities that determine that time, also known as the critical path. And then a risk management plan is a comprehensive plan documenting how risk will be managed on a given project. It contains processes, activities, milestones, organizations, responsibilities, and details of each risk management activity and how it is to be accomplished. It is an integral part of the project management plan. Cost effectiveness model assumes you are incurring a cost and focuses on the question of what the value of the cost is. This is a rational means of economic analysis used to determine the utility of a specific strategy. It is a nearly foregone conclusion you will be spending resources on security. This just reframes the question to one of utility and outcome from the activity. A relative term, total cost of ownership, is the set of all costs, everything from capital costs to operational and exception handling costs, that is associated with a technology. There's a lot of arguments over how to calculate total cost of ownership, typically to favor one solution over another. But that is not important in this instance. It is important to note that the difference between normal operational costs and exception handling. Exception handling is always more expensive. The objective in risk management is to have a set of overlapping controls such that the total cost of ownership is minimized. This means that the solution has a measured effectiveness across the risk spectrum and that exceptions are minimized. This is where the compliance versus security debate becomes interesting. We establish compliance rules for a variety of reasons, but once established, their future effectiveness depends upon the assumption that the same risk environment exists as when they were created. Should the risk, the value, or the impact change over time, the cost effectiveness of the compliance-directed control can shift, frequently in a negative fashion. So we've talked about risk management and different models in ways of looking at it. So what are some best practices that we can use with risk management? When looking at system vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities are characteristics of an asset that can be exploited by a threat to cause them harm. So all systems have bugs or errors. Not all errors or bugs are vulnerabilities. For an error or a bug to be classified as a vulnerability, it must be exploitable, meaning an attacker must be able to use the bug to cause the desired result. There are three elements needed for a vulnerability to occur. The system must have a flaw. The flaw must be accessible to an attacker. The attacker must possess the ability to exploit the flaw. So vulnerabilities can exist in many levels and for many causes. From design errors, coding errors, or unintended and untested combinations in complex systems, there are numerous forms of vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities can exist in software, hardware, and procedures, whether in the underlying system, in the security controls designed to protect that system, or in the procedure employed in the operational use of the system. The result is the same. A vulnerability represents an exploitable weakness that increases the level of risk associated with the system. A threat is any circumstances or event with the potential to cause harm to an asset. For example, a malicious hacker might choose to hack your system by using readily available hacking tools. Threats can be classified in groups, with the term threat vector describing the elements of these groups. A threat vector is a path or tool used by an attacker to attack a target. There are a wide range of threat vectors that a security professional needs to understand. There's the web, through things such as fake sites, session hijacking, malware, and watering hole attacks. There's wireless and unsecured hotspots, mobile devices, USB devices, email, and social engineering. This listing is merely a sample of threat vectors. From a defensive point of view, it is important not to become fixated on a specific threat, but rather pay attention to threat vectors. If a user visits a website that has malicious code, then the nature of the code, although important from a technical view in one respect, is not the primary concern. The primary issue is the malicious site, as this is the threat vector. Next, there's probability of threat likelihood. The probability or likelihood of an event is a measure of how often it is expected to occur. For a qualitative assessment, using terms such as frequent, occasional, and rare to the quantitative measure of annual rate of occurrence. The purpose is to allow scaling based on frequency of an event. Determining the specific probability of a security event with any accuracy is a nearly impossible feat. What is important in the use of probability and likelihoods is the relationship it has with respect to determining relative risk. What can be determined is that over some course of time, say the next year, a significant number of users will click malicious links in emails. The threat likelihood of different types of attacks will change over time. Years ago, web defacement was all the rage. Today, spear phishing is the most prevalent. Earlier, we kind of mentioned a risk strategy of avoiding or transferring risk to, let's say, an insurance company. So let's look at strategies a little bit closer. There's avoidance. Avoiding the risk can be accomplished in many ways. Although threats cannot be removed from the environment, one's exposure can be altered. Not deploying a module that increases risk is one manner of risk avoidance. So for example, it's a risk putting a public-facing website out there. Risk of defacement or SQL injections or whatever. So you could avoid to do it by just deciding you're not going to put that public-facing website out there. Then there's transference. It's another possible action to manage risk is to transfer a risk. A common method of transferring risk is to purchase insurance, and we mentioned that before. Insurance allows risk to be transferred to a third party that manages specific types of risk for multiple parties, thus reducing the individual cost. Now, one thing you need to keep understanding in transferring risk and getting insurance. The insurance usually has a requirement for certain types of controls to be in place in order for you to be covered by that insurance policy. For example, they might require a firewall which only allows certain traffic through. If you don't have a firewall, or you have a firewall that allows other traffic outside of what the insurance company thinks should be allowed onto your network, and a data incident does occur because, let's say, a port was used that they did not agree to cover, then the loss would not be covered by the insurance policy. It's kind of like if you were drunk driving. Many insurance companies don't necessarily cover damage created by you when you drink and drive because they don't want to cover the loss because of your negligence. Then there's mitigation. Risk can also be mitigated through the application of controls that reduce the impact of an attack. Controls can alert operators so that the level of exposure is reduced through process intervention. Controls can act to reduce the risk associated with potential high-risk operations. So you can use an IDS or you can use an IPS. IPS obviously being able to act on its own based upon activity that it's seeing. That's mitigating risk. Putting controls in place that help to reduce that risk. And then there's acceptance. Accepting risk is always an option. In fact, if risks are not addressed, then this action occurs by default. If you are not paying attention to your risks, you are just assuming or accepting the risk that you have if you're not doing anything to proactively avoid, transfer, or mitigate. It's kind of like that Rush song where you say, if you decide not to make a choice, you've still made a choice. Well, if you're choosing not to avoid, transfer, or mitigate, you have already accepted the risk. It's like driving a car uninsured, thinking that nothing's going to happen and you don't need the insurance. But if something does happen, you have now assumed the entire financial cost of whatever it was that happened. I'll be honest, this next area I'm not particularly strong in because the environment I work in, we don't work much with cloud computing. But the fact that a system is either in the cloud or virtualized does not change how risk works. Risk is everywhere, and changing a system to a new environment does not change the fact that there are risks. Complexity can increase risks, actually. So what might be simpler by having and maintaining your own servers and services that you now outsource to the cloud may actually make it more complicated of a risk. Because your cloud provider could be in a country that has a different set of rules, or different requirements for protecting data, and different ways of recuperating or holding that cloud provider accountable for the services you expect and the protections you expect on your data. There are specific risks associated with both virtualization and cloud environments. Having data and computing occurs in environments that are not under the direct control of the data owner adds both a layer of complexity and a degree of risk. The potential for issues with confidentiality, integrity, and availability increases with the loss of direct control over the environment. The virtualization and cloud layers also present new avenues of attack into the system. So one thing I often give is, you don't know who the administrators are for these companies. You haven't done any vetting yourself. You're assuming the company you're hiring has done proper vetting. This is why I'm very much against government moving to the cloud, especially military. Because if the cloud service is, let's say, Amazon, they have data centers throughout the world. So you need to pay particular attention to where that data is going, because you may not necessarily want your data going to a foreign country, either because there could be laws against it, or it could be providing that country with a competitive edge if they get access to that information. And you have to assume that once it leaves the boundaries of our country, it's not protected by the same laws that govern data protection inside our country. Security is a particular challenge when data and computations are handled by a remote party, as in the cloud computing. The specific challenge is how to allow data outside your enterprise and yet remain in control over the use of that data. The common answer is encryption. Through the proper use of encryption of data before it leaves the enterprise, external storage can still be performed securely by properly employing cryptographic elements on the data at your perimeter or before it leaves the perimeter. The security requirements associated with confidentiality, integrity, and availability remain the responsibility of the data owner, and measures must be taken to ensure that these requirements are met, regardless of the location or usage associated with the data. So if you're running a small store online and you're using Amazon Web Services or whatever as your back end, yes, they are responsible for running their service. But if their service goes down, guess what? It's your customers coming to your site who are affecting you if that service isn't there. So you're responsible for that. You need to make sure you have contracts in place that provide you with the level of service and protection you want for your business. Another level of protection is through the use of service level agreements with the cloud vendor, although these frequently cannot offer much remedy in the event of data loss. So usually service level agreements, it has to do with how much uptime or availability you will have, not for any protection against data losses. I'm your instructor, Peter Keurig for Nashville Community College. Thank you for watching.